Hi and welcome back to Social Work Sorted, the podcast, but this is also going on my YouTube channel. I am Vicki Shevlin. I lead and founded Social Work Sorted as an online platform of resources for newly qualified social workers. I am a qualified social worker myself. I've worked my whole career in child protection and safeguarding, and most recently as a child protection conference chair. And I started Social Work Sorted about 2 years ago to bring practical resources to newly qualified social workers. If you're not following me on Instagram, I'm on Instagram. I have Social Work Sorted, the podcast. I've got a blog on my website. I have a membership, The Collective, which is for students and newly qualified social workers. And I provide CPD accredited training to organisations and universities. And I'm going to be doing this mini series on managing difficult phone calls. Is really important to me. Everything I create, it doesn't just come from me thinking, oh, this might be a good idea for new social workers. It comes from you, new social workers who contact me and say, I'm having a hard time with this, or nobody's taught me about this, or it would really be helpful to have something training around this. And difficult phone calls comes up all the time. So I really wanted to break that down as a task and look at it step by step to support you, because phone conversations are a huge part of social work. I sort of wish they weren't. I wish we didn't rely as much on phones, and I think post-COVID our reliance on phone conversations really changed, and a lot of things probably shifted from information that should have been shared in person with people. It became more acceptable to share it over the phone, and I think that has still filtered through, even though we are no longer, within the pandemic and we don't have the same restrictions. Equally, for new social workers who trained in that time, the idea of making a phone call is slightly more intimidating if you haven't been in and around an office where you're listening to people, picking up on the way that they verbally communicate with people when they're on the phone, and it can feel very lonely. So I want to start with really unpicking this idea of what is a difficult phone call. What is it that makes this difficult before you've even picked up the phone to a specific person? Is it that person? Have they been labelled as difficult by somebody? Have you read a case note that describes them in a particular way? Is there sometimes on our online systems we might have warnings, which again, it's important that we're aware when there are risks, but sometimes I found that there can be specific warnings on people's records that don't necessarily fit where they are now. It might be from a couple of years ago. So before you've even made that phone call, are you thinking it's going to be difficult because of your perception of this particular person? It might be a parent, it might be a carer, it might be another social worker or a teacher or a doctor, or anyone else that we come into contact with. So really reflect on, do I think it's going to be difficult because of the person? Another reason why we might perceive a phone call to be difficult before we've even had it is the information that we need to share in that phone call. So sometimes we're ringing people up that we are familiar with and comfortable with. Sometimes we are ringing people up and it might be the first time that they've ever heard from a social worker, and we might need to tell them that somebody's made a referral about their child. And I've got a whole video on how you can manage incoming referrals and talk about that, so I'll link it wherever I can on this, or in the show notes on the podcast. But it might be that we have that difficult information to share with them. Again, throughout COVID and the pandemic, even more, more difficult information was being shared over the phone, that children might be taken to child protection conferences. You might have to share information about care proceedings. You might have to share information that somebody else has told you something about that person's child. So it might be that you're perceiving the phone call to be difficult because of what you need to say during that phone call and your worries about how that person is going to respond based on the information you're sharing. The other reason that phone calls might appear to be, or you might perceive them to be difficult, is the environment. So are you worried that it's going to be a difficult phone call because of where you are, whether that's at home, you might be worried that you're going to be by yourself and you've got no one to support you or give you an indication of what you might be doing well or not so, or what you might need to change. Or it might be that the environment is difficult, there's a very busy office and there's lots of people there, and you might feel really nervous and like everybody is listening into you and they're going to make judgments about you based on the phone conversation. Because it is a lot, I don't want to ever minimize, it can be really scary making a phone call as a new social worker. You're trying to think about what you need to say, how you need to introduce yourself, how you're going to share the information you're going to share, how you make sure that you don't breach any information sharing. So there's a lot going on at one time. It is not as simple as you just picking up the phone and saying hi and moving on with that. There is a lot to think about, and you should be thinking about it as well, because it's a key way of how we communicate with people. One thing that I found really difficult as a new social worker was thinking about noise levels. My fear was always, what if somebody shouts at me? So I'm just sharing that as an example because I perceived lots of phone calls that I thought they might be difficult because I thought that person was going to shout at me in response to what I was going to say. I want to come back to one of the definitions of difficulty, because I like language and I like us to think about where words come from, because when we're using a word like difficult, which often in social work is used to describe situations or individuals, I think we need to go back to where that comes from. I'm literally reading this, I don't know this kind of stuff off by heart, but it comes from a Latin term, and I think when you go back to Latin, facile is easy, and so difficult, the definition of difficult becomes not easy. And I quite like going back to those terms because it helps you reframe things. So instead of saying it's difficult, you can just say it's not easy. And not many things in life are easy. They require some effort and skill. And that is one, again, the definition around difficulty. One of the definitions says it requires effort and skill. So try and bring yourself back from perceiving difficult as impossible or scary or something to be afraid of. Reframe it. It's just something that's not easy and it requires effort and skill. And if you put in that effort, you will build that skill and they will become easier. So what can we do based on our initial perception? If we are worried or if we are perceiving that this is going to be a difficult phone call because that person, that individual is a difficult person, it's really important to step back and just go and, put ourselves in that person's shoes. You can do this really practically by putting their name in the middle of a piece of paper, and all around that paper, start to imagine what they might be feeling and what they might be thinking, and just put it down on paper. And it's just an exercise in empathy. It's an exercise in putting ourselves in their shoes and removing that label of difficult from that person, because whatever their past behaviour has been, whatever their response might be to you, it's going to be a reaction to how they are feeling, their experience of social work before, their perception of social work. So just as an exercise in separating that person from that definition, because it's unhelpful for us to label people as difficult. The next thing that you can do, if it is the content of what you're sharing, so if you're perceiving it's going to be a difficult phone conversation because of what I need to say, one thing that I like to do is write a little script. And I don't mean that you kind of read off it and it becomes really monotone as you're reading it out on a phone call. But one of the things that can be really challenging for us is when we are lost for words, because someone might say something or react in a certain way and we can't find the words. And if you've thought through this, if you've written out how you're going to explain things and the words that you're going to use, it can be a lot easier then to go ahead with that phone call. Your anxiety is going to be reduced, which means you're going to be able to manage that phone conversation in a better way for everybody. It's also worth noting that, and I know I do this, when I'm nervous or when I haven't prepared, probably you can see sometimes in these podcasts or these videos, I might ramble or I might not explain myself in the right way, and I might have to go back and reiterate things. If I've really thought about something, or if, like, say if I'm creating an Instagram post and I know it needs to be more succinct, I will think really carefully about the words that I use so that they are at a level that people can understand in a really simple way. And that's not because I don't think people have the capacity to understand complex things, but when you are on the phone, you are missing so much in terms of your communication. You're relying so heavily on that verbal communication, that the words you use matter because they can be very easily misinterpreted. So think about writing yourself a script, thinking through what you're going to say. I used to do this for the way that I introduce myself on the phone. So saying, hi, this is Vicky, I'm ringing from this local authority or this children's services. Can I speak to whoever? Because depending on who you ring, your introduction might be different. So use that as a template, really. Write out what you're going to say, and write out if you think people are going to have certain responses to you about certain things. Write down what you might do if that happens and respond to it, so you feel more prepared and the phone call will not appear to be as difficult for you. The final thing is to think about your environment. So again, like I said, a lot of new social workers say, actually, Vicky, the reason I think this phone call is going to be so difficult is because I'm just worried about people hearing me, and I'm going to get really flustered and panicked, and I feel like everybody's judging me and what I say and if I do something wrong. And there are two things that you can do that I would suggest if you connect with that. The first is to find a quiet space, if that's possible for you, and make a phone call when, you know, things aren't as busy or loud in an office, so that you feel calmer. The second thing you can do is ask somebody to listen to you. So instead of having that fear in your head of, oh, are they listening to me? Are they judging me? Am I doing this all wrong? Just ask them to listen. So you know that they're listening, so you remove that fear, but also then you ask for feedback. So you just say, would you mind listening to this phone conversation? I'm feeling a bit nervous about it. This is what I'm going to say. Will you let me know if it's all right? And will you just make sure that you listen in? So you remove that fear of, are they listening, are they not? You know they're listening, but they're then going to give you a little bit of feedback, and it might just be facing that head on. For me, like I said, I had this worry that someone was going to shout on me on the phone, shout at me when they were on the phone. And so what I found myself doing is thinking, okay, well, what am I going to do if they shout at me on the phone? Well, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to move the phone away from my ear. So the sensory experience of somebody shouting at me through the speaker doesn't overwhelm me. That was a really, and it sounds simple, and some people will automatically do that. But for me, it's really helpful to think that through, because I know that's something that I was worried about as a new social worker. So simply the act of moving the phone away, knowing that that's the first step I'm going to take if someone starts shouting at me, so I can think a little bit clearer. And I don't mean I'm going to just move it away and ignore them. I mean, I'm going to move it away so it's not right next to my ear, because that's going to be harder for me to then think through my responses. I hope that was helpful for you. We've talked about communication and verbal communication and non-verbal communication. I actually have a free training which I will link in the show notes of this video and of the podcast in confident communication. It's about a 20-minute video. You can go and watch that on my website and download a reflective guide to go with it. Make sure that you subscribe to this channel so you will be notified when part 2 of this series comes out. And please let me know in the comments if this was helpful, and if you can share it with another student or new social worker that will find it helpful, then please do. Thank you so much and take care.